Winter hit the Upper Peninsula early in 1886. Men across Black Spruce Settlement were stuffing rags into cabin cracks and stacking firewood for the first hard freeze, when they noticed something strange at the edge of the logging road. Harlan Eide, a widowed timber surveyor who lived alone north of the settlement, was tearing apart the wall behind his cook stove. Not repairing it, expanding it. The men watched him drag huge soapstone slabs into the cabin and build a thick masonry structure wide enough to hide a man inside. Young Eli Mercer frowned toward the doorway. "Where's the bedroom?" Old Amos Brigg laughed first. "There ain't one," he said. "Fools planning to sleep inside the stove." The others laughed with him, while the wind off Lake Superior pushed snow across the clearing. But Harlan never answered. He just kept setting stone after stone into place. And by January, those same men would stand inside that cabin with frost hanging from their beards, trying to understand how one man stayed warm at 50 below while their own walls froze solid around them. If stories like this still matter to you, subscribe and stay with the channel. Some frontier lessons were written in blood, cold, and hard winters. And most of them were learned too late. The winter before had already taken something from Harlan Eide. His wife, Clara, had died in February of 1885 inside a cabin, built the same way most frontier cabins were built. Tall sleeping loft overhead, cook stove below, warm air rising into empty darkness while the lower room stayed cold around the floorboards. At first, the cabin had seemed warm enough. Then came the wet freeze. Heavy snow turned to sleet. Sleet turned to ice. Wind pushed through the log seams night after night. The loft trapped the heat during the evenings, but before dawn, the warmth thinned out and drifted upward into the rafters while cold settled back down through the blankets. Clara started coughing before Christmas. By January, blood sometimes appeared in the cloth she held against her mouth after waking. Harlan buried her on a ridge above a frozen cedar swamp, where the black trees stood half-buried in snowdrifts until spring. After the funeral, the settlement expected grief to break him or whiskey to finish the job. Instead, he became quiet, dangerously quiet. He stopped lingering at the store, stopped joining card games after logging runs. But at night, lamplight still burned inside his cabin long after midnight. Men passing the road sometimes saw strange things through the frost-covered windows. A candle flame held near cracks in the wall, bits of chalk marking frost lines across beams. Blankets hung beside different corners of the room to test drafts. Later, during timber surveys north of Marquette, Harlan began sleeping beside massive masonry heaters in old Finnish logging camps. Not because they were comfortable, because they stayed warm long after the fires burned low. And one night, while staring up into the dark rafters of his own freezing loft, he finally understood the thing nobody in Black Spruce Settlement seemed to understand. Most frontier cabins failed in winter for one simple reason. They tried to heat air, and air never stopped escaping. By early October, Harlan Eide had become a regular sight inside Jonah Reeves' general store. Not at the whiskey shelf, not near the stove where the loggers played cards after dark. Always at the supply counter. He bought fire clay by the sack, river sand, stove brick, bundles of shredded cedar fiber usually used for packing freight crates. Then came the strange purchases. Salvaged soapstone slabs hauled down from an abandoned fishing station along the lakeshore. Heavy iron clean-out doors. Extra flue pipe. Mason tools. The growing pile behind the counter began drawing attention. Conversations stopped when Harlan walked in. Men watched him the way farmers watched a horse, showing signs of going lame. One afternoon, Jonah finally asked the question everyone else had been circling around. "You rebuilding the stove?" Harlan rested one hand on a soapstone slab darkened from years of old smoke and lake weather. "No," he said. Then he looked toward the frost-clouded window beside the counter. "Rebuilding the way the cabin holds heat." That answer spread through Black Spruce Settlement before sunset. Not because people understood it, because they didn't. The real work began during the second week of October. Harlan tore open the entire masonry wall behind the cook stove. Not recklessly, not like a desperate man swinging at stone out of grief. Every block came out in order. Before removing each one, he marked it with charcoal symbols across the surface so he could track exactly where it had originally rested inside the structure. Men passing the road noticed something strange almost immediately. The stove was no longer staying narrow. Instead of rebuilding upward, Harlan rebuilt outward into the room itself. The new structure widened day by day into a thick masonry spine made from layered soapstone, stove brick, and packed river mortar. Inside that growing mass, hidden from view, he began shaping a recessed chamber large enough for a man to sleep curled inside. But the first version failed. 3 days into a stretch of damp lake weather, smoke stopped drawing properly through the inner passage. Gray smoke spilled low across the floorboards and rolled halfway to the door before escaping. Eli Mercer nearly doubled over laughing when he saw it. "Man's building his own smoke coffin," he shouted from the wagon road. Old Amos Brigg laughed harder than anyone. For a moment, it looked like they might be right. But Harlan never argued. The next morning, settlers saw him outside beside the woodpile building strange little models from scrap tin piping, stove brick fragments, and pine boards no bigger than bread loaves. He burned strips of resin-heavy pine inside them and watched how the smoke moved through each angle and chamber. Again and again. Some designs pulled too fast. Others stalled completely. By the fourth evening, the smoke finally moved the way he wanted. Slow, hot, controlled. The next fire inside the cabin burned clean. And for the first time, a few men in Black Spruce Settlement stopped laughing quite so loudly when they passed his road. By the final week of October, Harlan Idey's cabin had begun to look finished. From the outside, it seemed ordinary enough. Smoke rising from the chimney, split cedar stacked beside the porch, ice forming in the water barrel every morning before sunrise. Inside, though, something felt wrong the moment a visitor stepped through the door. There was a cook stove, a rough table near the south wall, a carpenter's bench covered in tools, shelves for salt pork, lamp oil, and flour sacks. But there was no bed, no bunk, no loft ladder, nothing. Women coming back from Sunday service started talking about it before they even reached the main road. Nora Bellamy, the blacksmith's sister-in-law and the fastest gossip in Black Spruce Settlement, told anyone willing to listen that grief had finally turned Harlan wild. "Man's gone feral," she said. Even Reverend Silas Pike, a narrow-faced circuit preacher who usually avoided settlement quarrels, made quiet mention of the cabin during a church supper. "A proper house ought breathe like a Christian home," he remarked while warming his hands beside the stove. "Not seal a man up beside fire like smoked meat." By then, Harlan had nearly finished the hidden chamber. The recessed berth sat deep inside the masonry spine behind the cook stove, lined with smooth tamarack planks sanded flat by hand. Between the inner and outer wooden layers, he packed dense cedar fibers to trap dead air. A narrow vent slot near the upper corner could be opened or closed, depending on draft conditions. The hatch door itself was lined with old wool blankets stitched beneath canvas. From the main room, it looked less like a bedroom than a sealed compartment inside a machine. And that was exactly what unsettled people. Not because they thought it looked uncomfortable, because it looked intentional. The first full test came on a windless night near the end of October. Harlan fed the cook stove steadily for almost 5 hours before sunset. Cedar first, then hard maple, then 2 thick pieces of ironwood laid deep into the firebox to carry heat slowly through the night. The masonry spine absorbed everything. By dark, the satin walls radiated warmth even after the visible flames settled low behind the stove door. Harlan waited another hour before opening the hatch. He carried only 4 things inside the recessed berth: an oil lamp, a notebook, a thermometer, and a single wool blanket folded beneath one arm. Then he sealed the hatch behind him. The silence inside felt different from the rest of the cabin. Heavy. Still, the kind of silence that existed deep underground or beneath heavy snowfall. Heat moved slowly through the soapstone beside his shoulder, not sharp, like open fire, but steady, patient. Most important of all, there was no draft. No invisible stream of cold air crawling across his neck. No shifting pockets of freezing air descending from rafters overhead. Outside, frost thickened across the clearing under a pale moon. By midnight, the water bucket on the porch had frozen solid. But inside the masonry berth, Warmth remained trapped close around the body instead of drifting upward into empty space. At dawn, Harlan opened the hatch and checked the thermometer readings. Outside temperature, 11 degrees. Main cabin air, 41. Inside the recessed berth, 67. For a long moment, he simply stood there staring at the numbers. It was the first time he had awakened warm since Clara died. But the system was not perfect yet. Near the upper vent slot, a thin line of condensation had formed during the night. Tiny ice crystals clung to one corner seam where warm air met cold wood too quickly. Harlan touched the frozen edge with one finger. Then he reached for his notebook. Before breakfast, he was already changing the vent geometry. The first real snow arrived on a Sunday morning. Thin at first, dry flakes blowing sideways across the churchyard while wagons lined up beside the meeting hall. Men stamped snow from their boots near the entrance. Women gathered in small circles beneath gray wool shawls, speaking quietly while the wind carried chimney smoke low across the clearing. That was where the story finally escaped Harlan's road and became settlement entertainment. Nora Bellamy told it loud enough for nearly everyone to hear. "Harlan Ide sleeps in the stove now," she announced, like a trapped badger hiding in a cookpot. Laughter rolled through the churchyard almost immediately. Old Amos Brigg leaned against a wagon wheel, grinning through his frost-covered beard. "Next winter," he said, "we'll just shovel coal straight onto him and save the trouble of cutting firewood." Even the men who normally stayed quiet joined in after that. Eli Mercer took it further than the others. The young trapper had spent one season helping repair stove flues in a mining camp near Ironwood, which was enough experience to make him sound confident around people who knew even less. "That setup's going to kill him," Eli warned loudly. "Smoke poisoning, bad draft, chimney collapse. Man seals himself in there one bad night, and nobody'll even hear him die." Nobody openly defended Harlan, not Reverend Pike, not the loggers, not the families listening from the church steps. Only Jonah Reeves stayed silent near the doorway, watching the conversation without joining it. Harlan heard every word. He stood near the hitching posts, holding a sack of lamp oil and winter salt, snow collecting slowly across the shoulders of his coat. But he never answered. That night, while the settlement repeated jokes beside their supper fires, Harlan sat alone inside the warm glow of his cabin, recording thermometer readings into his notebook. Outside temperature, cabin temperature, masonry berth temperature, line by line, careful as a surveyor marking river depth before winter ice. November settled over Black Spruce Settlement like a slow tightening vise. The lake wind grew sharper each week. Frost thickened along fence posts before sunset. By morning, the horse troughs needed breaking open with axe handles before animals could drink. Inside his cabin, Harlan Ide kept measuring. Every morning before daylight, he opened the notebook beside the stove and wrote the same figures in the same order. Outside temperature, main cabin temperature, temperature inside the masonry berth, burn duration, amount of wood consumed overnight. At first, the numbers surprised even him. The recessed berth stayed consistently above 60 degrees long after the visible fire had burned down to ash. More importantly, the warmth stayed low and close, instead of drifting uselessly into the rafters. Small details began proving the system right before the thermometer ever did. Butter left beside the masonry wall remained soft enough to spread at dawn. Coffee poured before bed still carried faint steam by sunrise. Wet gloves hung beside the hatch dried overnight instead of freezing stiff by morning. And every evening, an old brindle camp dog from the logging road scratched at Harlan's porch until the door opened, then crossed the room and curled itself tightly against the warm masonry hatch without hesitation. Animals trusted heat faster than people did. Meanwhile, the rest of the settlement was already beginning to struggle. Drafts crept through sleeping lofts before midnight. Wash basins froze solid near outer walls. Families burned through wood piles faster than expected because most of their heat disappeared upward into open cabin space. Some men responded by feeding their stoves harder, which only made the cabins swing between unbearable heat at supper time and bitter cold before dawn. Harlan noticed something else by the second week of November. His own woodpile was shrinking far slower than everyone else's. After checking the numbers 3 different times, He finally reached a conclusion that seemed almost impossible. The cabin was using nearly 40% less firewood than a standard settlement cabin of similar size. Not because the fire burned hotter, because almost none of the heat escaped into empty air anymore. One night, Harlan stood quietly beside the stove while snow drifted against the windows outside. The old camp dog slept against the hatch. The butter near the stone wall stayed soft. Steam still lifted from a tin cup, long after midnight. For the first time since Clara's death, the cabin no longer felt like something fighting winter. It felt prepared for it. The first real storm arrived 3 nights before Thanksgiving. Not loose powder snow, wet lake snow. Heavy snow driven sideways by wind coming hard off Superior. The kind that packed itself into roof seams, froze against shutters, and turned chimney tops into solid collars of ice before dawn. By midnight, Black Spruce Settlement had almost disappeared behind white haze and blowing frost. Cabins began failing one by one. Smoke rolled backward through badly drawing flues. Sleeping lofts lost heat faster than stoves could replace it. Men woke coughing as smoke leaked low across floorboards. Families shoved blankets against doors while wind screamed through shrinking gaps in the logs. And for the first time since beginning the project, Harlan Ide discovered a serious weakness inside his own system. Ice had begun forming along the outer flue cap, where warm exhaust met the freezing lake wind. Slowly, almost invisibly, the buildup narrowed the draft opening until the stove spine could no longer vent heat correctly. At first the problem seemed small. Then the smoke pressure changed. Warm air inside the masonry passages suddenly pushed backward instead of upward. Thin gray smoke leaked from the cleanout seam beside the floor. The draft no longer sounded steady. It pulsed unevenly inside the walls like breathing. For nearly an hour, the entire system stood close to failure. Most men would have opened windows and abandoned the experiment right there. Harlan did the opposite. He pulled on his wool coat, wrapped a scarf across his mouth, and climbed onto the roof directly into the storm. Wind hit hard enough to force him onto one knee beside the chimney. Ice had already sealed half the outer cap shut. He hacked at it with the back of a hatchet, while smoke and sparks blasted sideways across the roofline. The moment the draft reopened, heat surged upward through the flue again. But Harlan did not stop there. Back inside, he heated an iron sleeve section directly in the stove fire until it glowed dull red, then fitted it temporarily inside the upper draft opening to keep ice from reforming too quickly during temperature swings. By sunrise, the storm had buried half the porch beneath wet snowdrifts. Several cabins in the settlement still smelled faintly of trapped smoke and damp ash. But inside Harlan's recessed masonry berth, the thermometer remained just above 60 degrees. Not perfect warmth, not luxury, but stable. And stability was what winter respected most. The storm finally broke sometime near noon the next day. Clouds drifted east. Smoke rose straight again from the settlement chimneys. Men came out carrying shovels and axes to dig doors free from packed snow. That afternoon, Jonah Reeve walked the road to Harlan's cabin alone. He did not come to laugh. He did not come to argue. He simply stood inside the doorway for a long moment, studying the massive masonry spine glowing faintly warm beside the cook stove. Then Harlan opened the hatch. Jonah crouched carefully and stepped inside the recessed berth. The space was narrow, but the warmth settled around the body almost immediately. Not sharp heat, deep heat, the kind that stayed inside stone long after flames disappeared. For nearly half a minute, Jonah said nothing. Then he rested one rough hand against the soapstone wall, and his expression changed. "My grandfather slept against brick like this," he said quietly. "Back in the Finland timber camps." Harlan looked up from the stove, but did not answer. Jonah kept his hand against the warm stone another few seconds, almost like a man recognizing something he had not seen since childhood. That evening inside the general store, the jokes started again when Eli Mercer mentioned the stove sleeper. But this time Jonah interrupted before the laughter could spread. "It works," he said simply. The room went still after that. Not because everyone believed him yet, because Jonah Reeve was not a man known for saying things he did not mean. December ended under gray skies. Then the Arctic system arrived. Not with blizzard winds, not with dramatic snowfall. The worst cold rarely announced itself that way. It came quietly. The clouds vanished. The air stopped moving. Sound carried too far across the frozen timberland. And every morning after that, the temperature dropped lower, 5 below, 15 below, 28 below. By the fourth day, even the lake wind disappeared. The world outside Black Spruce Settlement became perfectly still, as if the cold itself had frozen movement out of the air. That was when the cabins began failing. Sleeping lofts became impossible first. Warm air rose into the rafters during supper, then vanished before dawn, leaving blankets stiff with frost around the edges. Families climbed down ladders in the middle of the night to sleep beside stoves like refugees gathered around campfires. Lamp oil thickened inside glass reservoirs. Wash water froze solid beside interior walls. Timber beams cracked sharply after midnight as the cold tightened through the grain. Some people woke to frost spreading across the inside of their blankets, where breath had frozen layer by layer through the night. Children started coughing, then coughing harder. By the sixth morning, Mary Rowe's youngest boy was wheezing badly enough that neighbors could hear it from the porch steps. The child had spent 3 nights sleeping beneath a loft draft, where freezing air rolled downward from the roof seams after midnight. Eli Mercer tried hauling extra cedar logs from the timber edge before sunrise, and returned with patches of white frostbite spreading across one cheek and the edge of his nose. He no longer joked much after that. Old Amos Brigg burned through his seasoned woodpile 2 weeks earlier than planned. By New Year's Day, he had started feeding green-cut pine into the stove just to keep his family alive through the nights. Smoke clung thick inside his cabin. Sap hissed in the firebox. The walls still felt cold before morning. And all the while, the Arctic system kept tightening. 35 below, 41 below. At the settlement edge, chickens froze dead on their roosts after a coop draft opened during the night. A mule collapsed beside the logging trail before dawn and never stood again. The cold no longer felt like weather. It felt deliberate. Inside his cabin, Harlan Ide adapted instead of fighting it. He reduced the size of his overnight burns to avoid overheating the masonry too quickly. Large fires wasted fuel and pushed excess heat into the flue before the stone could absorb it properly. Smaller controlled burns worked better. He adjusted the dampers by minutes instead of hours now. At midnight, he woke briefly to recharge the stove spine with 2 short ironwood burns. At 4 in the morning, he repeated the cycle again. Then the hatch closed softly, and the stone continued releasing stored warmth through the darkness while the fire settled low. Outside, exposure temperatures near the lake edge approached 50 below during the worst nights. Inside the recessed masonry berth, the thermometer never fell below 64 degrees. The difference transformed everything. Coffee beside the stone wall still steamed faintly at dawn. Wet scarves dried overnight instead of freezing stiff. The old camp dog refused to sleep anywhere except against the hatch. Most important of all, Harlan no longer woke to cold air settling across his face at 3 in the morning the way it always had inside the loft. The warmth stayed, where a human body actually lived. Low, close, contained. By the 9th day of the freeze, even the settlement skeptics had stopped mocking the cabin with no bedroom. Now they watched the smoke rising from Harlan's chimney, the way starving men watched another hunter return from the woods carrying meat, because the cold had stripped away pride by then, and nature only respected what survived it. On the 10th morning of the freeze, Mary Rowe, the wife of a struggling sawmill laborer from the south edge of Black Spruce Settlement, walked through the snow, carrying her youngest son wrapped inside 2 wool blankets. The boy could not have been older than 6. His breathing sounded wet and shallow beneath the cloth covering his mouth. Every few seconds, another hard cough shook through his chest hard enough to bend his small body forward in her arms. Mary did not knock when she reached Harlan's cabin. She simply stepped inside, carrying the child while frost melted from the hem of her coat onto the floorboards. For a moment, nobody spoke. The cook stove glowed softly beside the masonry spine. A coffee pot rested near the iron plate, still steaming faintly despite the brutal cold outside. Then Harlan opened the hatch. Mary hesitated when she first looked inside the recessed berth. Most people still did. The chamber looked too small, too enclosed, too strange compared to ordinary frontier sleeping spaces. But the warmth rolling gently from the stone walls changed something immediately. She climbed inside, holding the boy against her chest, while Harlan closed the hatch most of the way to trap the heat. Time passed quietly after that. Outside, the settlement continued freezing beneath the Arctic stillness. Timber cracked somewhere deep in the woods like distant rifle shots. Frost thickened against the cabin windows. Inside the masonry berth, the boy's breathing slowly changed. The sharp wheezing softened first. Then the coughing spaced farther apart. Nearly 2 hours later, the child finally fell asleep against the warm soapstone wall, with one small hand resting near the vent slot where fresh air entered the chamber. Mary stared at him for several seconds without moving. The color had started returning to his face. When she finally climbed back out, her eyes drifted slowly across the masonry spine, studying it differently now. Not like a curiosity, not like a joke, like a tool. She accepted a cup of coffee from Harlan and stood warming her hands against the tin mug before speaking. Could a smaller version be built against an ordinary stove? Harlan nodded once, not proudly, just practically. Then he showed her. He explained how the heat chamber worked best when built low beside the stove instead of above it, how trapped dead air mattered more than large sleeping space, how thick mass stored heat longer than open flame, how a narrow vent kept air breathable without letting warmth escape too quickly. Mary listened carefully to every word. Because by then, nobody in Black Spruce Settlement was laughing at the man sleeping inside his stove anymore. Now they were trying to remember every detail. The changes began quietly after that. No town meeting. No public apology. Frontier settlements almost never admitted they had been wrong out loud. Pride survived winter nearly as stubbornly as people did. But within 2 weeks, signs started appearing all across Black Spruce Settlement. Old Amos Brigg was the first. One evening, a passing logger noticed fresh masonry work behind Amos's stove wall, where no masonry had existed before. By the next morning, rough-cut planks had been stacked nearby, narrow enough to fit a sleeping recess instead of a full bunk. Amos never mentioned it publicly. But he also never joked about Harlan again. Eli Mercer changed next. The young trapper still spoke loudly inside Jonah Reeves' store, but now he spent more time asking questions than making predictions. One night after closing, Jonah caught him sketching vent patterns onto scrap paper while trying to copy the airflow geometry Harlan had used inside the recessed berth. Even Reverend Silas Pike began asking careful questions after Sunday service. Not about sleeping beside fire anymore, about fuel consumption, about heat retention, about whether smaller cabins might survive harder winters with less wood if heat stayed closer to the body instead of rising into rafters. The settlement itself slowly began changing shape. Fresh chimney additions appeared beside old cabins. Sleeping lofts were abandoned in favor of lower enclosed bunks. Some families built shallow masonry recesses directly behind existing cook stoves. Others added insulated hatch doors made from layered wool and timber scraps. Nobody called them stove coffins anymore. Now they were simply practical improvements. Jonah Reeve eventually added a heated berth behind the store stove for travelers caught overnight during storms. Teamsters arriving from logging camps noticed immediately how long the warmth remained after the fire settled low. And through all of it, Harlan Idey never behaved like a man who had won an argument. He never reminded anyone what they used to say about him, never demanded credit, never even explained more than people asked. He simply kept tending the stove, adjusting the dampers, and recording temperatures in the notebook each night, while the settlement quietly rebuilt itself around an idea it had once laughed at. Because in the end, people rarely copied opinions, they copied results. By the spring thaw of 1887, the story had spread beyond Black Spruce Settlement. At first, it traveled through logging camps and freight routes. Teamsters carried it north, trappers carried it west. Men sleeping in frozen bunkhouses repeated the same strange detail beside campfires late at night. A cabin with no bedroom, a man sleeping inside the stove wall. Eventually, the story reached a regional newspaper in Marquette. A reporter arrived weeks later, expecting either madness or exaggeration. Instead, he found Harlan Eide sitting beside a warm masonry spine while meltwater dripped steadily from the cabin roof outside. The reporter asked about the design, the vent geometry, the heat retention, the fuel savings. And finally, he asked the question people always asked once they realized the system truly worked. "Did you invent this yourself?" Harlan looked toward the soapstone wall before answering. "No," he said quietly. "Cold places figured this out long before us." That answer mattered more than most people understood at the time, because the truth was larger than one Michigan cabin. Long before Black Spruce Settlement existed, Russian families had slept atop massive Pechka stoves that released stored heat slowly through brutal winters. Finnish logging camps built masonry sleeping beds against heated stone walls for the same reason Harlan had rebuilt his own cabin. In Korea, Ondol floor systems carried warmth beneath living spaces through carefully controlled flues. Trappers across the northern territories sometimes built enclosed wall berths, low beside masonry chimneys, because heat near the ground survived the night longer than heat trapped in open rafters. Different civilizations, different languages, different continents. Yet the principle remained almost identical everywhere. Winter became deadly enough. Do not waste heat trying to warm empty space. Store it inside mass. Keep it close to the human body. The newspaper eventually printed the story under the headline, "Stove, Wall Sleeping Chambers Reduce Fuel Use During Northern Freeze." By then, several settlements around the Upper Peninsula had already begun copying simplified versions of the design. And slowly, the thing people once mocked as frontier madness became something else entirely. Practical knowledge, the kind that survived because nature kept proving it true. That was the strange thing about old wisdom. Most of it did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because easier winters made people forget why it mattered in the first place. Many years later, long after the old logging roads disappeared beneath forest growth and cedar roots swallowed the remains of abandoned camps, Harlan Eide's cabin still stood at the edge of the ridge, above the frozen swamp. By then, Harlan himself had become part of local history. Children who once slept inside improvised masonry berths during hard winters grew old enough to build cabins of their own. Some of those cabins still carried traces of his ideas hidden behind stove walls and beneath rebuilt chimneys. Eventually, the County Historical Society preserved the original cabin before the roof could finally collapse under age and snow load. Visitors who entered the structure decades later often reacted the same way the settlers once had. At first, the room looked too small, too plain. Then they noticed the missing bedroom. The old masonry spine still occupied nearly an entire side of the cabin. Even after all those years, the soapstone retained heat with unnatural patience during demonstration burns, held each winter for visitors and schoolchildren. Guides opened the hatch door carefully so people could peer inside the recessed berth where Harlan once slept through the freeze of 1,887. They pointed out the adjustable vent slot near the upper corner, the thick soapstone core, the layered insulation cavity, the iron cleanout doors blackened by decades of smoke. Most people touched the warm masonry wall instinctively when they stepped near it, just as Jonah Reeve once had. Inside a glass case near the window sat Harlan's weathered notebook. The pages had yellowed badly over time. Some corners still carried smoke stains from nights spent beside the stove, recording temperatures while the settlement outside slowly froze. Page after page listed measurements in careful handwriting. Outdoor temperature, cabin temperature, berth temperature, wood consumption, draft conditions, not theories, evidence. Near the final pages, one short sentence appeared beneath a winter entry written in faded pencil. Cold hunts empty space. No speech, no celebration. Just an observation earned the hard way. And in the end, that was what the valley remembered. Not the jokes, not the laughter beside the churchyard, not the men calling the cabin a coffin or a furnace trap. The valley remembered which cabins stayed warm when the temperature fell low enough to kill the unprepared. Because nature never cared who sounded confident. It only cared what actually worked. Would you have laughed at Harlan's cabin too? Or would you have trusted the man sleeping inside the stove wall?